In remote Searchlight, Nevada, a 67-year-old grandmother was about to shatter her fundamentalist community's strictest rules. What started as a routine church meeting took a shocking turn when Pastor David Hayes banned her life's work as worldly vanity. Emma Mitchell wasn't your typical senior. For 5 decades, she'd served as the community's historian, known for her hidden intellect and meticulous records. When Hayes dismissed her genealogy research, she had no idea she was walking into digital rebellion. Emma's defiant response would lead to her becoming an unlikely social media sensation. What began as preserving family history would become viral, inspiration for millions seeking late-life transformation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The metal folding chair creaked beneath Emma Mitchell as she shifted forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. Around her, 63 other members of the Faith's Haven community sat in similarly uncomfortable silence, their faces turned toward the makeshift podium where Pastor David Hayes commanded attention with the practiced authority of a man half his age wielding twice the power. Brothers and sisters, David's voice carried the measured cadence that had drawn so many to follow him over the past decade. We gather tonight to address a growing cancer in our midst. The world beyond our borders grows more corrupt with each passing day, and its poison seeps through every crack we leave unsealed. Emma's fingers traced the worn leather cover of the notebook in her lap. 47 years of meticulous records, family trees, birth dates, and stories that formed the living history of their community. She'd started keeping these records as a young bride, encouraged by David's father, Pastor Samuel Hayes, who'd understood that preserving their heritage was sacred work. Now, watching the son gesture dismissively toward anything that connected them to the outside world, Emma felt a familiar knot tightening in her chest. The internet, David continued, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for speaking of sin itself, has become the devil's own highway. It carries lies, temptation, and corruption directly into homes, into hearts, into the minds of our children. We've been too permissive, too trusting. That changes tonight. Around the room, Emma watched faces she'd known for decades. Martha Stevens, who'd lost her husband last winter and hadn't been the same since. Bill Crawford, whose arthritis had gotten so bad he could barely work his farm anymore. These weren't dangerous radicals. They were tired, aging people who'd found comfort in the community's embrace. Yet David spoke to them as if they were children incapable of making their own decisions. Effective immediately, David announced, all internet access for genealogy research, historical documentation, or communication with outside sources is strictly forbidden. These activities serve no purpose but to feed vanity and curiosity, the very sins that led to man's fall from Eden. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She thought of the half-finished family tree she'd been working on for 3 years. The gaps in records she'd hoped to fill by connecting with distant relatives who'd left the community decades ago. The stories of the founding families that only existed in fragments, scattered across databases she'd finally learned to access through her son Timothy's patient teaching during his rare visits. Emma's voice cut through the murmur of agreement before she could stop herself. Pastor Hayes, with respect, some of us have spent our entire lives documenting our community's history. Surely there's a difference between idle curiosity and preserving our heritage. The room fell silent. In 48 years of marriage to Robert Mitchell, in the 12 years since his death, in all her decades of faithful service, Emma had never publicly questioned pastoral authority. The words had emerged from some deep place she'd forgotten existed, a place that remembered the young woman who'd once dreamed of teaching, of learning, of exploring beyond the boundaries others set for her. David's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw something flicker there. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Sister Mitchell, I understand you're attachment to these worldly pursuits. But attachment itself is the problem. We must ask ourselves, does this activity draw us closer to God, or does it feed the ego? Does it strengthen our community's faith, or does it create connections to those who've abandoned the narrow path? It preserves our history, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her hands. The stories of how we came to be, the sacrifices our founders made. Surely that has value. Our history, David's voice hardened, begins with our faith in Jesus Christ. Everything else is distraction. Sister Mitchell, I fear your years have perhaps made you sentimental about things that ultimately don't matter in the eternal scope of God's plan. The dismissal stung more than Emma expected. Around her, she felt the subtle shift of bodies in chairs, the careful avoidance of eye contact that meant people agreed with David, but were too uncomfortable to say so. These were her friends, her community, people she'd counseled through grief and celebrated with in joy. Yet not one of them met her eyes as their pastor essentially called her a foolish old woman clinging to meaningless pursuits. Emma closed her notebook and stood. I understand your position, Pastor. I'll pray on it. The lie came easier than it should have. She wouldn't pray on it. She'd already made her decision in the moment David had dismissed decades of her work as sentimental distraction. But the words were what was expected, what would allow her to leave with dignity intact. As the meeting continued with announcements about upcoming work projects and reminders about proper dress codes, Emma barely listened. Instead, she found herself studying David Hayes with new eyes. When had the gentle boy who'd grown up calling her Aunt Emma become this calculating man who wielded scripture like a weapon? When had protecting the community become about controlling every aspect of their members' lives? The walk to her small cabin felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of what she'd just experienced. The October air carried the desert's nighttime chill, and Emma pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 67, she felt every one of her years tonight, along with the sudden, startling awareness of how many years she might have left. Inside her cabin, Emma lit the kerosene lamp and sat at her kitchen table, the notebook open before her, page after page of careful handwriting, charts showing marriages and births, notes about families who'd left and occasionally sent word back. 47 years of work, dismissed in a single evening as vanity. She thought of Robert, who'd been gone 12 years now, but whose presence still felt strongest in this small space they'd shared for 36 years of marriage. He'd been proud of her record-keeping, had often said she had the mind of a natural historian. What would he think of tonight's proclamation? Almost without thinking, Emma walked to their old bedroom and knelt beside the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She'd avoided looking through Robert's personal things for years. Grief had made it too painful, and then habit had made it unnecessary. But tonight, something compelled her to lift the heavy lid and breathe in the faint scent of cedar and the aftershave he'd worn. His clothes were folded neatly on top, but underneath, Emma found the small leather journal she'd given him for their 20th anniversary. Robert had been a private man, not given to writing, but she'd thought he might enjoy recording his thoughts about the gardens he loved to tend. The journal fell open to an entry dated just 6 months before his death. David Hayes visited today to discuss the new restrictions on outside reading materials. I nodded and agreed, as I always do, but I find myself troubled. When did faith become about cutting ourselves off from all knowledge? Emma wants to research her grandmother's family in Texas, says she found some records that might help fill in the gaps in our community history. I told her to be careful, not to let David know. But why should my wife have to hide her desire to understand where she came from? When did curiosity become sin? Emma's breath caught. She read the entry again, then turned the pages, finding more. Emma asked me today what I thought about Timothy going to college. I told her what I always tell her. that we must trust God's plan. But the truth is, I'm proud of that boy's mind. He could do anything he set his mind to. Is it wrong to want more for your children than the narrow path allows? When did wanting the best for our family become unfaithful? Sometimes I watch Emma with the other women, and I see how she dims herself. She's the smartest person in this community, man or woman, but she's learned to hide it. I failed her by not encouraging her to shine brighter. If something happens to me, I hope she finds the courage to be everything she's capable of being. The journal slipped from Emma's trembling hands. Robert had seen what she'd hidden even from herself, the gradual dimming of her natural curiosity, the slow erosion of dreams she'd barely admitted having. He'd watched her become smaller year by year, and it had troubled him enough to write about it in the privacy of his own thoughts. She thought about David's words tonight, about her sentimental attachment to meaningless pursuits. Then she thought about the half-finished family tree, about the stories that would die with her if she didn't preserve them, about the young woman she'd once been who'd dreamed of becoming a teacher before being told that marriage and service to the community were more appropriate goals. Emma Mitchell had spent 67 years living someone else's version of righteousness. She'd been a dutiful daughter, a faithful wife, a devoted community member. She'd counseled young women to accept limitations, guided families through crises, according to the community's narrow definitions of proper behavior, and slowly, quietly, buried every dream that didn't fit within the approved boundaries. But reading Robert's words, feeling the weight of time passing and opportunities lost, Emma realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She wasn't dead yet. She still had time, maybe years, maybe decades, to discover who she might have been if she'd been allowed to grow without limits. The Searchlight Public Library was 23 miles away. She'd driven past it countless times over the years, never stopping, never even considering what might be inside. But tomorrow morning, while the rest of the community was busy with their assigned tasks and comfortable routines, Emma Mitchell was going to find out what she'd been missing. The decision settled into her bones with a rightness that felt almost like prayer. Almost like the kind of faith she'd thought she'd lost somewhere along the way. Not faith in David Hayes's narrow vision of righteousness, but faith in the possibility that it wasn't too late to become the person God had actually intended her to be. Emma closed Robert's journal and held it against her chest. Tomorrow, she would take the first step into a world she'd been told was forbidden. Tonight, for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she turned the key in her old Honda's ignition. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty community grounds as she pulled out of her driveway, grateful that most residents would be busy with their assigned morning tasks. The 23-mile drive to Searchlight felt both endless and far too short, her mind oscillating between determination and terror with each mile marker. The Searchlight Public Library sat on a dusty corner lot, its modest brick facade looking nothing like the fortress of forbidden knowledge she'd imagined. Emma parked and sat for a moment, watching a young mother help her toddler up the front steps. Such an ordinary scene, yet Emma felt as if she were crossing into enemy territory. The automatic doors whispered open, and cool air conditioning washed over her. Inside, the library hummed with quiet activity. Teenagers at computers, elderly men reading newspapers, children sprawled on colorful carpets with picture books. The normalcy of it struck her. This was what she'd been taught to fear? These peaceful people pursuing knowledge and connection? Can I help you? The voice belonged to a woman about Emma's age, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a cardigan that looked hand-knitted. Her name tag read, Janet Coleman, reference. Librarian. I'm looking for information about genealogy research, Emma said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Family history. I'm not sure where to start. Janet's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Oh, wonderful. Genealogy is one of my favorite subjects to help with. Have you done any research before, or are you starting from scratch? Emma found herself explaining about her notebook, her years of careful record-keeping, the gaps in her family tree that she'd always wanted to fill. She didn't mention the community, the restrictions, the meeting that had driven her here. Janet listened with the kind of focused attention Emma hadn't experienced in years. "Let me show you the genealogy section first," Janet said, leading Emma through the stacks. "But honestly, the real treasure trove is online. We have computers with access to all the major genealogy databases. Would you like me to show you?" Emma's heart pounded. "I've never used a computer before." "No problem at all," Janet said warmly. "Everyone starts somewhere. Computer literacy classes for seniors are some of our most popular programs. But for today, I can walk you through the basics." The computer monitor seemed impossibly large and bright as Janet guided Emma through the basics. How to use the mouse, how to click, how to type in search boxes. Emma's first search for Mitchell Family Texas 1800s yielded thousands of results, and she gasped at the abundance of information. "This is incredible," Emma whispered, scrolling through census records, marriage certificates, ship manifests. In 30 minutes, she'd found more information about her great-grandmother than she'd discovered in years of asking relatives. "Wait until you see what else is available," Janet said with a smile. "There are websites where people share family, stories, photo collections, even DNA testing results that can connect you with distant relatives." As the morning progressed, Emma became increasingly absorbed in the digital world unfolding before her. Janet showed her how to create email accounts, explained social media platforms, and demonstrated video calling. Each new concept felt like discovering a new sense. Suddenly, the world was vast and connected in ways Emma had never imagined. "There are people who document their genealogy research online," Janet mentioned casually. "Some create videos about their discoveries, share family stories. There's quite a community of people interested in family history." Emma's fingers paused over the keyboard. "Videos? Regular people make videos?" "Oh yes. YouTube is full of them." "Let me show you." Janet pulled up video after video, grandmothers sharing family recipes, elderly men telling war stories, women Emma's age discussing everything from gardening to philosophy. Emma watched, mesmerized, as a woman who looked remarkably like her talked directly to the camera about discovering her family's immigration story. "She's just talking to people she doesn't know?" Emma asked. "That's exactly what she's doing. And look." Janet pointed to the view counter. 47,000 people have watched this video. She's connecting with people all over the world who share her interests. Emma stared at the screen, something stirring deep in her chest. These people weren't performing or pretending. They were simply sharing their authentic experiences, their knowledge, their stories, and people were listening. People cared. "Could anyone make a video like this?" Emma asked quietly. "Anyone with a phone or a computer camera. The library has equipment you can borrow if you're interested in trying." By afternoon, Emma had created her first email address, browsed dozens of genealogy websites, and watched hours of videos made by ordinary people sharing extraordinary stories. When Janet offered to show her how the video recording equipment worked, Emma found herself nodding yes before her cautious mind could object. "The key to good video content," Janet explained as she adjusted the camera, "is authenticity. People connect with real stories, genuine emotions. They can tell when someone is being themselves versus putting on an act." Emma looked into the camera lens, seeing her own face reflected in the black circle. 67 years old, weathered by desert sun and grief, lined with experiences she'd never been allowed to fully explore. For the first time in decades, she didn't see a woman who was too old, too set in her ways, too late to matter. She saw someone with stories worth telling. "What would I even talk about?" Emma asked. "What's your story? What brought you here today?" Emma considered the question. Her story. Not the community's version of her story, not the role she'd been assigned, but her actual story. The curiosity that had driven her to document family histories, the dreams she'd set aside, the courage it had taken to walk through these library doors. I think, Emma said slowly, I'd want to talk about what it's like to discover the world when you're 67 years old. What it's like to realize you've been living in a small room when there was always a mansion available. Janet smiled and pressed the record button. That sounds like exactly the kind of story people need to hear. Emma took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. For the first time in her adult life, she was about to speak her own truth, in her own words, without permission from anyone. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. Emma took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. For the first time in her adult life, she was about to speak her own truth, in her own words, without permission from anyone. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. Hello, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. My name is Emma Mitchell, and I'm 67 years old. Yesterday, I was told that my desire to research my family's history was vanity, that wanting to understand where I came from was somehow sinful. She paused, gathering courage. Today, I'm sitting in a public library, using a computer, for the first time in my life, and I've discovered something remarkable. There's a whole world out here that I've never been allowed to see. The words flowed easier than expected. Emma found herself talking about the community meeting, about Pastor David's dismissal of her life's work, about Robert's hidden journal, and the realization that she'd spent decades making herself smaller to fit someone else's vision of righteousness. I don't know who might watch this, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. But if you're someone who's ever been told you're too old to learn something new, too set in your ways to change, or that your curiosity is somehow inappropriate, I want you to know that's not true. I learned to use email this morning. I'm recording a video this afternoon, and I have no idea what I might discover tomorrow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Janet finally pressed stop, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being completely, authentically herself. That was beautiful, Janet said softly. Would you like me to show you how to upload it to YouTube? 3 hours later, Emma sat staring at her laptop screen in amazement. Her video, titled 67 and Learning My First Day with Technology, had been live for 2 hours and already had 53 views and 12 comments. Real people, strangers from around the world, were responding to her story. Thank you for sharing this. My grandmother would have loved your courage. I'm 58 and just started college. Your video made me cry happy tears. More, please. Your story is exactly what I needed to hear today. Emma read each comment twice, overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. These people didn't know her, had no obligation to her, yet they'd taken time to watch her story and respond with encouragement. It was the opposite of everything she'd been taught about the outside world. Over the following weeks, Emma established a routine. 3 mornings a week, she drove to the library, telling community members she was visiting her nephew Timothy, if anyone asked. She learned video editing basics, discovered social media platforms, and began documenting her journey of late-life digital discovery. Her second video, What I Learned in Week 2, garnered over 300 views. The third, Finding My Great-Grandmother Online, broke 1,000. Emma's natural storytelling ability, honed through decades of counseling community members, translated perfectly to video format. Her authentic voice, combined with the unique perspective of someone discovering technology at 67, began attracting a devoted following. You have a gift for this, Janet observed one afternoon as Emma finished editing a video about learning to use social media. Have you thought about what you want to do with this platform? Emma paused, considering. Each week brought new discoveries, not just about technology, but about herself. She'd started getting emails from other seniors who felt trapped by family expectations or religious restrictions, women who'd sublimated their dreams for decades, people who believed it was too late to change their lives. I think, Emma said slowly, I want to show people that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. That age doesn't disqualify you from growth or change or even rebellion, if that's what it takes. Her most powerful video yet came in week 4, The Hidden Journal That Changed Everything. Emma shared excerpts from Robert's writing, his regrets about her dimming herself, his pride in their son's education despite community disapproval, the vulnerability in her voice as she read his words about hoping she'd find courage to shine resonated deeply with viewers. The video went viral overnight. 50,000 views became 100,000, then 200,000. Comments poured in from around the world, children of strict religious communities, spouses who'd lost themselves in marriages, seniors who thought their adventures were over. Emma's story had touched something universal, the dream of authentic self-discovery, no matter how late in life it came. With viral success came unexpected opportunities. A lifestyle brand reached out about a partnership. Senior wisdom for modern living. The offer was modest but real money, the first Emma had ever earned independently. The idea of being paid for sharing her authentic experience felt surreal. It's called influencer marketing, Janet explained, helping Emma understand the business side of her newfound platform. Companies pay content creators to promote products authentically to their audiences. If you believe in what they're selling, it can be a legitimate way to monetize your platform. Emma stared at the partnership offer, her mind reeling. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a voiceless elder in a community that saw her as past her usefulness. Now, strangers valued her opinion enough to pay for it. The transformation felt impossible, yet here was proof in black and white. But as Emma drove home that evening, careful to arrive before the community's dinner hour, she felt the weight of her double life pressing down. Each day, the deception grew harder. She sat through community meetings where Pastor David preached against the corrupting influence of technology, nodding along while secretly planning her next video. She counseled younger women to accept their limitations while privately documenting her own liberation. The close call came on a Thursday afternoon. Emma was leaving the library when she spotted Martha Stevens's pickup truck at the gas station across the street. Heart pounding, Emma ducked behind her Honda until Martha drove away. The encounter lasted seconds, but it shattered Emma's sense of safety. That night, alone in her cabin, Emma faced the truth she'd been avoiding. Her online success was growing too large to hide indefinitely. The community was too small, the outside world too connected. Eventually, someone would discover her secret life, and when they did, everything would change. Emma opened her laptop and began typing her next video script. It was time to stop hiding and start living fully in both worlds, or risk losing everything she'd worked to build. Emma opened her laptop and began typing her next video script. It was time to stop hiding and start living fully in both worlds, or risk losing everything she'd worked to build. But before she could finish the thought, her phone buzzed with an email notification that would change everything. The message came from an address she didn't recognize, Martinez, Vegas Agmail. Com. The subject line read, "From someone who understands. Dear Emma, I've been watching your videos for weeks, and I finally worked up the courage to write. 12 years ago, I was in your exact position. A lifelong member of Faith's Haven who finally realized I couldn't live someone else's version of my life anymore. My name is Helen Martinez. I knew your late husband, Robert. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. There are things you should know about what lies ahead. A friend who escaped. Emma stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Someone from her community, her former community, had found her. But instead of condemnation, Helen offered understanding. Emma remembered her vaguely. A quiet woman who'd left suddenly after her husband died, causing weeks of whispered speculation about her breakdown and spiritual failure. Emma typed back immediately, suggesting they meet at a diner in Vegas the following week. The next few days passed in a blur of nervous energy. Emma continued her library visits, uploaded 2 more videos, and tried to act normal during community interactions. But everything felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending change. On Tuesday afternoon, while editing a video about learning to use Instagram, Emma felt someone's presence behind her. She turned to find Bobby Wilson standing hesitantly nearby, his weathered hands twisting a baseball cap. "Bobby?" Emma said, surprised. At 72, Bobby was one of the community's most respected members, a widower whose engineering background had made him invaluable for maintaining their solar power systems and water pumps. "What brings you to the library?" Bobby's eyes darted around nervously before settling on her screen. "Emma, I need to tell you something. I've been watching your videos." The admission hung between them like a confession. Emma's mind raced. If Bobby knew, who else might know? How long before Pastor David found out? "I lost my Sarah 2 years ago," Bobby continued quietly, referring to his wife of 47 years. "And lately, I've been questioning things. Why can't I video call my grandchildren in Phoenix? Why can't I research the engineering articles that might help our solar grid run more efficiently? Your videos. They've given me hope that maybe it's not too late to want more." Emma studied his face, seeing her own journey reflected in his eyes. "Bobby, you could get in serious trouble just for being here." "I know." He pulled up a chair beside her. "But I've been thinking about what you said in that video about Robert's journal, about how we've all been making ourselves smaller. I've got skills, Emma. Real skills with technology that I've been hiding because they're worldly. What if we could help each other?" The conspiratorial whisper in his voice sent a thrill through Emma. An ally, not just any ally, but someone with technical expertise she desperately needed. "What did you have in mind?" Emma asked. "I could help you with the technical side of your videos. Better audio, improved editing, and maybe—" Bobby's voice dropped even lower. "Maybe I could start documenting some of my own stories. About the old days, before David took over. Before we all got so afraid of the outside world." Over the next hour, Bobby revealed the depth of his hidden knowledge. He'd been secretly maintaining email correspondence with his grandchildren, had taught himself advanced computer programming, and had even been following technology forums to better understand the equipment he maintained. Like Emma, he'd been living a double life, but his had been going on for years. "There are others," Bobby admitted finally. "People who have questions but are afraid to voice them. Young people especially. Some of the teenagers have been asking me about college, about careers that require technology. I've been giving them quiet advice, but what? Emma, Pastor David knows something's changing. He's been watching people more closely, asking pointed questions about where folks go during their free time. And there's talk of implementing new restrictions, monitored internet access only for essential community business, supervised by church leadership." Emma's blood chilled. If David instituted supervised internet access, her secret would be exposed immediately. That Saturday, Emma drove to Las Vegas with a mixture of anticipation and terror. Helen Martinez was waiting at a corner booth in a modest diner, her graying hair styled in a way that would have been forbidden in Faith's Haven, wearing pants and a sleeveless blouse that marked her definitively as an outsider now. "Emma." Helen stood and embraced her warmly. "You look good, younger somehow." They ordered coffee, and Emma found herself studying Helen's face, searching for signs of the spiritual destruction Pastor David always predicted for those who left. Instead, she saw peace, confidence, and a kind of settled contentment Emma hadn't felt in decades. "Tell me about your videos," Helen said. "Tell me about this new life you're building." Emma shared everything: the viral videos, the brand partnerships, the growing audience of seniors finding inspiration in her story. Helen listened intently, occasionally asking practical questions about money, legal protections, and long-term planning. "The community will try to destroy this," Helen said finally. "When David realizes what you're doing, he won't just forbid it, he'll make you an example. They'll paint you as mentally incompetent, spiritually deceived, a danger to the young people. Are you prepared for that?" Emma's hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. "I don't know. I don't know if I'm strong enough." "I wasn't either," Helen said gently. "But you know what I learned? The life you build outside is worth the pain of leaving. And Emma, you're not alone anymore. There are networks of people who've left restrictive religious communities, support systems, legal resources, even financial help for people starting over." Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "This is my financial advisor. I work as a bookkeeper now. Nothing glamorous, but it's mine. I have my own apartment. I video call my daughter in California every week, and I've never been happier. If you decide to leave completely, there are people who can help." As Emma drove home, Helen's words echoed in her mind. The choice was crystallizing: continue the dangerous double life that was becoming increasingly unsustainable, or take the terrifying leap into complete independence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bobby. David announced a special meeting tomorrow night, addressing spiritual threats in our community. "Emma, I think he knows." Emma pulled over to the side of the desert highway, her hands shaking as she stared at the message. The collision between her two worlds was no longer approaching. It was here. Tomorrow night, everything would change. She looked out at the vast Nevada landscape, the endless sky that had always made her feel both small and infinite. For the first time in her life, Emma Mitchell was about to choose her own path forward, regardless of the consequences. The only question now was whether she'd face that choice alone, or with the allies who were finally stepping out of the shadows. The only question now was whether she'd face that choice alone, or with the allies who were finally stepping out of the shadows. Emma's answer came sooner than expected when her phone rang at dawn the next morning. Timothy's voice was strained with worry. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you meet me at the old gas station on Highway 95? It's important." An hour later, Emma sat across from her son in his rental car, studying the lines of stress around his eyes. At 42, Timothy had built a successful consulting business in Denver. But right now, he looked like the conflicted teenager who'd left Faith's Haven for college 24 years ago. "Mom, your videos—" Timothy began, then stopped, running his hands through his hair. "Jesus, I don't even know where to start. Margaret called me last night, crying. She's terrified." Emma's heart clenched. Margaret, her 45-year-old daughter, had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who'd managed to maintain relationships with both her mother in the community and her brother in the outside world. "The teenagers found your channel," Timothy continued. "Sarah, your granddaughter, she's been watching your videos and sharing them with her friends. Pastor David called an emergency meeting of the family councils. They're demanding Margaret publicly denounce you or face shunning herself." The words hit Emma like physical blows. Sarah, her bright 16-year-old granddaughter who'd always asked too many questions, who'd inherited Emma's curiosity and intelligence. Now that curiosity was putting her own family at risk. "There's more," Timothy said gently. "Your story's gone national, Mom. The podcast you did with Helen Martinez about religious trauma. It's been shared thousands of times. Good Morning America wants to interview you. A publisher is interested in your story." Emma stared at her son, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was telling her. How do you know all this? Because your social media manager called me, Sophia Rodriguez. Apparently you listed me as an emergency contact. Mom, you have over 2 million followers now. Your influence is... Timothy shook his head in amazement. You've become a symbol for late-life authenticity and religious freedom. People are calling you the grandmother of digital rebellion. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. She'd started making videos to preserve family history, and now her own family was fracturing because of her success. I have to see Margaret, Emma said. She's too scared to meet openly. But... Timothy hesitated. She asked me to give you this. He handed Emma a handwritten letter, and she recognized her daughter's careful script immediately. Mama, I'm so proud of you and so terrified at the same time. Watching your videos, I see the woman I always knew you were but never got to fully meet. You're brave in ways I never learned to be. But they're forcing me to choose between supporting you and protecting my children's place in the only community they've ever known. Sarah begs me to let her leave for college like Uncle Timothy did, but if I support that now, they'll cast out our entire family. I don't know how to choose between loving you and protecting my babies. Please understand if I can't stand with you publicly. But know that privately, you've shown me what courage looks like. Your daughter who loves you. Emma's hands trembled as she finished reading. This was the true cost of her freedom. Watching her daughter face the same impossible choice between authenticity and security that Emma had wrestled with for decades. There's something else, Timothy said quietly. I've been getting calls from other families in similar communities across the country. Your story has inspired people to leave restrictive situations, but it's also created a backlash. Some religious leaders are using you as an example of what happens when women step outside traditional roles. Emma thought of Helen's warning. They'll make you an example. She'd become exactly that, both inspiration and cautionary tale, depending on who was telling the story. The community meeting is tonight, Timothy continued. Margaret says Pastor David is calling for formal excommunication proceedings. They want to make it clear that your influence won't be tolerated. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of two worlds pulling her in opposite directions. In one direction lay her growing platform, the thousands of people who found hope in her story, the publishers and producers who wanted to amplify her voice. In the other direction lay her family, her history, the familiar comfort of a community that had defined her for 67 years. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bobby. Emma, they know about my involvement too. I've made my choice. Whatever happens tonight, you're not facing it alone. Then another message, this one from an unknown number. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Sarah. I know Grandma isn't supposed to have this phone, but I had to tell you, your videos changed my life. I applied to colleges in secret. I got accepted to 3 of them. I want to be like you when I grow up, brave enough to choose my own path. Don't stop because of us. Some of us need to see that escape is possible. Love, your granddaughter. Emma stared at the message, tears blurring her vision. Sarah, brilliant, curious Sarah, had found her own path to rebellion. The next generation was already making different choices, using Emma's example to envision possibilities beyond the community's narrow boundaries. Mom? Timothy's voice was gentle. What are you going to do? Emma looked at her son. This successful man who'd found the courage to leave at 18, but had spent 24 years carefully maintaining bridges to his family. She thought of Margaret, trapped between loyalty and fear. She thought of Sarah, already planning her own escape. She thought of Bobby, ready to face consequences for supporting her. She thought of Helen, who'd rebuilt her life at 58 and found happiness on her own terms. I'm going to that meeting tonight, Emma said finally. But not to apologize or ask for forgiveness. I'm going to tell them exactly who I've become and give anyone else who's ready the permission to make their own choice. Timothy nodded slowly. I'll be there too. It's time I stopped hiding in the middle. As Emma drove home to prepare for the confrontation that would define the rest of her life, she felt a strange peace settling over her. For the first time in 67 years, she was going to speak her complete truth to the people who'd shaped her, regardless of the consequences. Tonight, Emma Mitchell would stop being the person Faith's Haven had created and become fully the woman she'd chosen to be. The only question remaining was how many others would find the courage to join her. Tonight, Emma Mitchell would stop being the person Faith's Haven had created and become fully the woman she'd chosen to be. The only question remaining was how many others would find the courage to join her. The community meeting hall had never felt smaller. Emma arrived 15 minutes early, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. A simple blue dress that was modest enough to meet community standards, but paired with a silver necklace Timothy had given her for Christmas, a small act of defiance that represented the outside world she'd embraced. Pastor David stood at the front of the room, his usual commanding presence intensified by obvious anger. Behind him sat the Council of Elders, 5 men who'd known Emma for decades, who'd once valued her counsel and respected her wisdom. Tonight, their faces were closed, distant, as if she'd already become a stranger. "Sister Mitchell," David said as she took her usual seat in the 3rd row. "I'm surprised you chose to attend tonight's gathering." "I've attended community meetings for 48 years, Emma replied calmly. "I saw no reason to stop now." Murmurs rippled through the hall as other members filed in. Emma recognized the complex mix of emotions on familiar faces: curiosity, fear, disappointment, and in a few cases, barely concealed admiration. Martha Stevens wouldn't meet her eyes. Bill Crawford nodded slightly, which might have been greeting or judgment. The surprise came when Bobby Wilson entered and deliberately sat beside Emma. Then another shock. Ruth Hayes, Pastor David's own 78-year-old mother, took the seat on Emma's other side. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room, especially David, whose jaw tightened as he watched his own mother offer silent support to the woman he was about to condemn. "Brothers and sisters," David began, his voice carrying the weight of righteous authority, "we gather tonight to address a cancer that has metastasized within our community. Sister Emma Mitchell has chosen to embrace the very worldliness we've spent decades protecting ourselves against." He gestured toward a laptop connected to a projector, an irony that wasn't lost on Emma, given his frequent sermons against technology. Her YouTube channel appeared on the white wall behind him, showing video thumbnails of her journey from religious compliance to digital freedom. 2 million followers, David announced, his voice dripping with disgust. 2 million strangers, who now know our private business, who've been fed lies about our community by someone we trusted as an elder. Emma felt the room's energy shift as members saw the scope of her online presence for the first time. Some faces showed shock, others curiosity. A few displayed what looked like pride. "Sister Mitchell," David continued, "you've violated every principle of separation from worldly influence that defines our faith. You've brought shame upon your family, confusion to our young people, and attention from outsiders who seek to destroy our way of life." Emma stood slowly, feeling the weight of 67 years and 6 decades of silence lifting from her shoulders. "Pastor Hayes, may I respond?" "You may confess your sins and ask forgiveness," David replied coldly. "Nothing else is appropriate at this time." "Then I'm afraid we have different understandings of what's appropriate." Emma walked to the front of the room, turning to face the congregation she'd served faithfully for nearly 5 decades. These people had been her world. She'd counseled their children, mourned their losses, celebrated their joys. Many were now looking at her as if she'd become something dangerous and unfamiliar. "My name is Emma Mitchell," she began, using the same opening she'd perfected in her videos. "I'm 67 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm speaking my complete truth to people who matter to me." David moved to interrupt, but Ruth Hayes spoke sharply. David, let her speak. This community was built on the principle that truth doesn't fear examination. Emma nodded gratefully to the older woman before continuing. 6 months ago, I was told that my desire to research my family's history was vanity. That curiosity about the world beyond our borders was spiritual weakness. That my questions about why we're forbidden to use tools that could help us connect with family members, learn new skills, or simply understand the world we're meant to be salt and light in, that these questions were inappropriate for a woman my age. She looked around the room, making eye contact with people she'd known for decades. I discovered something remarkable when I finally had the courage to seek answers. The world isn't the evil place we've been taught to fear. It's full of people seeking meaning, connection, and wisdom, the same things we seek here. And they value the life experience and perspective of older adults like us. Emma pulled out her phone, another small act of rebellion, and read from her notes. In the past month, my videos have received messages from a 72-year-old grandmother in Japan who left an abusive marriage after watching my story about late-life courage, a 68-year-old retired teacher in Ohio who enrolled in computer classes after seeing me learn technology, dozens of people who've found the strength to leave restrictive religious situations because they saw that it's possible to rebuild your life at any age. You've led people away from faith, David interrupted, his composure finally cracking. I've led people toward authentic life, Emma replied firmly. And if that threatens your version of faith, perhaps the problem isn't with my influence. The room fell silent. In 48 years of marriage and community membership, Emma had never directly challenged pastoral authority in public. The precedent was unprecedented and dangerous. There's something else you should know, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. I'm not the only one who's been questioning the increasing restrictions, the growing isolation, the fear-based control that's replaced the loving community this place used to be. She looked at Bobby, who stood slowly. I've been maintaining email correspondence with my grandchildren for 3 years, he announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his confession. I've been researching engineering solutions that could improve our solar systems and water management. And I've been helping other community members learn technology skills in secret because I believe knowledge is a gift from God, not a tool of the devil. Gasps echoed through the room. Bobby Wilson, the reliable engineer, the man who'd maintained their infrastructure for decades, was confessing to the same worldly activities they were condemning Emma for. Brother Wilson, David's voice was dangerously quiet. Are you confessing to corrupting influence as well? I'm confessing to being fully human, Bobby replied. To refusing to make myself smaller than God created me to be. Ruth Hayes stood next, her aged voice carrying the authority of her late husband's legacy. David, I watched your father lead this community with love, wisdom, and trust in people's ability to make good choices. What I see now is fear, control, and the kind of spiritual pride that Scripture warns against. Emma watched Pastor David's face cycle through shock, rage, and something that looked like desperation. His authority was crumbling in real time, challenged not by outside forces but by the very people who'd given him power. This community, David said, his voice strained, cannot survive if we abandon the principles that protect us from worldly corruption. This community, Emma replied, cannot survive if we abandon the people who've built it. Some of us have spent our entire adult lives serving this place. We've earned the right to ask questions, to grow, to choose our own relationships with faith and technology and the wider world. She looked around the room one final time. Anyone who wants to know about my online platform, my videos, or the opportunities I've discovered in the outside world is welcome to contact me. Anyone who's been hiding their own questions, their own curiosity, their own dreams of something beyond these borders, you're not alone. Emma walked toward the door, Bobby and Ruth beside her. As they reached the exit, Timothy appeared, having arrived as promised to support his mother publicly for the first time in 24 years. "Sister Mitchell," David called out, his voice echoing in the suddenly fractured room. "If you leave tonight, there's no coming back. You'll be formally excommunicated, cut off from this community forever." Emma paused at the threshold, looking back at the place that had shaped her for 67 years. "Pastor Hayes, I'm not leaving this community. I'm simply refusing to let it make me smaller than I was meant to be. Anyone who wants to join me in that choice knows where to find me." As the door closed behind them, Emma heard the murmur of voices rising inside, some angry, some confused, but some, she hoped, newly curious about the possibilities she'd revealed. Standing in the desert night with her son, her new romantic partner, and the mother of the man who'd tried to silence her, Emma Mitchell felt the terrifying freedom of having burned every bridge to her old life while building the foundation of something entirely new. Standing in the desert night with her son, her new romantic partner, and the mother of the man who'd tried to silence her, Emma Mitchell felt the terrifying freedom of having burned every bridge to her old life while building the foundation of something entirely new. The aftermath came swiftly. By morning, Emma's phone buzzed with messages from community members, some condemning her spiritual rebellion, others asking careful questions about her online platform. But the message that changed everything came from an unexpected source. CNN's religious affairs correspondent. "Mrs. Mitchell, we'd like to feature your story in a documentary about religious freedom and late-life reinvention. Would you be willing to speak with our production team?" Within days, Emma's small cabin became the unlikely center of a media storm. Documentary crews, podcast hosts, and journalists made the pilgrimage to Searchlight, drawn by the compelling narrative of a grandmother who'd become a symbol of authentic living at any age. Emma found herself being quoted in articles about religious trauma, featured in segments about senior entrepreneurship, and invited to speak at conferences about digital literacy for older adults. Sofia Rodriguez arrived on a Thursday morning, her rental car looking out of place among the desert landscape. At 28, she was everything Emma had never been allowed to be: confident, independent, financially successful on her own terms. But what struck Emma most was Sofia's genuine respect for her story. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sofia said as they sat in Emma's small living room, surrounded by notebooks full of family history, "you've accidentally built one of the most powerful personal brands in the senior demographic. Your authenticity resonates because people can tell you're not performing. You're just being yourself." Emma laughed, still adjusting to the idea that being herself could be considered a business strategy. "6 months ago, I didn't even know what a brand was." "That's exactly why yours is so powerful," Sofia explained, pulling out charts and analytics that showed Emma's reach across demographics. "Your content performs well with women over 50, but you're also reaching younger audiences who see you as inspiration for their own parents or grandparents. And your engagement rates are off the charts because people trust you." The business side of her influence still felt surreal, but Emma was learning to embrace it. The brand partnerships had grown from modest supplement endorsements to major collaborations with technology companies, travel brands, and educational platforms. Each partnership brought not just income, more money than Emma had ever imagined having, but also opportunities to reach new audiences with her message of late-life possibility. "There's something else," Sofia continued. "We've been contacted by people wanting to start similar communities, places where seniors can live together while maintaining full autonomy and access to technology. Some are calling it the Emma Mitchell model of conscious aging." Emma stared at the proposal document Sofia spread across her coffee table. Retirement communities were requesting her endorsement, organizations focused on religious trauma, recovery wanted her as a spokesperson, and publishers were offering substantial advances for her memoir. The scope of her influence was expanding beyond anything she'd imagined when she first sat down in front of a library camera. But the success came with mounting pressure from Faith's haven. Pastor David's response to Emma's defiance had been swift and comprehensive. The community formally excommunicated her, cut off her access to the shared well water, and began pressuring local businesses to refuse her service. More troubling, they'd launched what amounted to a propaganda campaign, spreading word through other fundamentalist communities that Emma was mentally unstable, possibly possessed, and certainly dangerous to traditional family values. The real test came when Sarah Mitchell Thompson appeared at Emma's door on a Saturday afternoon, her 16-year-old face streaked with tears and set with determination that reminded Emma powerfully of herself. "Grandma Emma," Sarah said, "they found out about my college applications. Mom's in trouble because she didn't report that I'd been watching your videos. They're saying our whole family needs intensive spiritual counseling to undo your influence." Emma's heart broke watching her granddaughter struggle with the same constraints that had defined her own youth. But she also saw something she'd never possessed at 16, a clear sense of her own worth and potential. "What do you want to do?" Emma asked gently. "I want to leave," Sarah said without hesitation. "I want to go to college, study journalism, maybe work in digital media." "Like you do. But if I leave now, they'll completely cut off Mom and my little brothers. I can't destroy my family to save myself." Emma recognized the impossible choice, the same one Margaret faced, the same one she'd wrestled with for decades. But watching Sarah articulate her dreams with such clarity, Emma realized something crucial. The next generation didn't have to accept these limitations as permanent. "What if," Emma said slowly, "we created a different option?" Over the following weeks, Emma and Sophia worked with legal advocates to establish something unprecedented, a scholarship and support fund specifically for young people leaving restrictive religious communities. Using Emma's platform and growing network of supporters, they raised money to help teenagers like Sarah transition to independent lives while maintaining some connection to their families. The fund's first recipient was Sarah, who accepted a full scholarship to study journalism at the University of Nevada. But more importantly, the fund's existence sent a message throughout fundamentalist communities across the country. There were options beyond submission or complete family estrangement. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Pastor David organized a coalition of religious leaders to condemn Emma's campaign to destroy families, and several fundamentalist news outlets ran pieces portraying her as a predator targeting vulnerable teenagers. The attacks were vicious and personal, questioning her mental state, her motives, and her right to influence young people. Emma found herself facing threats, both online and in person. Someone spray-painted Devil's Tool on her cabin. Her car? Tires were slashed twice. Local businesses that had initially welcomed the media attention began asking her to shop elsewhere. "Are you sure this is worth it?" Timothy asked during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "You could relocate to Las Vegas, build your platform somewhere safer." Emma looked around her small cabin, then out at the desert landscape she'd called home for 47 years. "Running away won't help the people who are still trapped here. And it won't help the Sarah Mitchell Thompsons in other communities who need to see that change is possible." The battle lines were clearly drawn now. On one side stood Emma's growing network of supporters, former community members who'd found freedom, seniors inspired by her example, young people planning their own escapes, and allies like Sophia, who understood the broader implications of her story. On the other side was an entrenched system of religious authority that saw her influence as an existential threat. The conflict came to a head when Pastor David made a desperate final play. He petitioned the county to have Emma declared mentally incompetent, arguing that her sudden behavioral changes indicated dementia or psychological breakdown. The legal challenge forced Emma to undergo court-ordered psychological evaluation, a humiliating process designed to undermine her credibility and authority. But David had underestimated both Emma's mental acuity and the strength of her support network. The psychological evaluation concluded that Emma showed no signs of cognitive decline or mental illness. Instead, the psychologist's report described her as a woman experiencing healthy personal growth and authentic self-discovery at a life stage when many people begin to decline. The failed competency challenge backfired spectacularly, generating national news coverage that painted David as desperate and authoritarian while showcasing Emma's dignity and clarity. The story trended on social media, bringing Emma's follower count to over 5 million and attracting support from unexpected sources, including other religious leaders who condemned David's tactics as unchristian and abusive. Standing in her cabin that evening, surrounded by legal documents that proved her competency and media coverage that validated her choices, Emma felt something she'd never experienced before: the power that comes from being completely, authentically, herself in the face of those who demand conformity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still families to reunite, communities to heal, and young people to help escape restrictive situations. But tonight, Emma Mitchell was exactly who she was meant to be, and no authority on earth could take that away from her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still families to reunite, communities to heal, and young people to help escape restrictive situations. But tonight, Emma Mitchell was exactly who she was meant to be, and no authority on earth could take that away from her. 6 months later, Emma stood on the stage of the Las Vegas Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 800 people who'd traveled from across the country for the first annual Authentic Aging Conference. At 68, she'd learned to project her voice without a microphone, to command attention with presence rather than volume. The transformation from silent community elder to confident public speaker still amazed her. When I was 67, Emma began, using her now familiar opening, I thought my story was over. I thought the only chapters left to write were about accepting limitations, making peace with regrets, and slowly fading into the background of other people's lives. The audience, mostly women over 50, but peppered with younger advocates and family members, listened with the kind of focused attention Emma had learned to recognize. These were people hungry for permission to change, to grow, to refuse the narrative that their best years were behind them. What I discovered, Emma continued, is that the most important chapters of our lives might be the ones we write when we finally stop asking permission to be ourselves. In the front row sat Helen Martinez, now Emma's business partner and closest friend. Beside her, Bobby Wilson beamed with pride. They'd announced their engagement 2 months ago, a decision that had shocked Faith's Haven but delighted Emma's online community. At 68 and 73, they'd proven that love, like authenticity, had no expiration date. Sofia Rodriguez worked from the wings, managing the live stream that would reach Emma's now 7 million followers worldwide. The conference was being broadcast in real time, with simultaneous translation into 12 languages. Emma's story had transcended cultural boundaries, resonating with women from restrictive societies around the globe. But the moment that meant most to Emma came when she spotted a familiar figure entering from the back of the auditorium. Margaret Mitchell Davis walked carefully down the aisle, her face a mixture of nervousness and determination. For the first time in over a year, Emma's daughter had come to hear her mother speak publicly. Emma's voice caught slightly as she continued her presentation, but she pressed on, sharing statistics about the nonprofit organization she and Sophia had established. The Second Chapter Foundation had helped over 300 people transition out of restrictive religious situations, provided technology education to thousands of seniors, and awarded scholarships to 47 young people seeking education beyond their community's approval. The most common question I'm asked, Emma said, her eyes finding Margaret in the crowd, is whether the cost was worth it, whether losing relationships, facing rejection, and starting over at 67 was worth the freedom I found. She paused, thinking of all the complicated truths that simple question contained. The honest answer is that some costs never stop hurting. Some relationships may never heal. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt exactly as they were. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and Emma felt her own throat tighten with emotion. But what I've learned is that authentic relationships, the ones built on truth rather than compliance, on love rather than control, those relationships can grow stronger when we show up as our complete selves. Sometimes the people we think we'll lose are actually waiting for permission to be authentic too. After the presentation, Emma made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions. When she finally reached Margaret, they stood facing each other with the weight of 18 months of estrangement between them. "Mom," Margaret said quietly, "I've been watching your videos, all of them." Emma reached for her daughter's hand. "How are the kids?" "Sarah's thriving at college. She's majoring in journalism and digital media, just like she planned. She talks about you constantly." Margaret's voice wavered. The boys ask why they can't see Grandma Emma anymore. "And how are you?" Emma asked gently. Margaret's composure finally broke. "I'm questioning everything. The community, the restrictions, the way I've been raising my children. David's gotten so controlling since you left. He monitors our internet usage, demands reports on who we talk to, what we read. It's suffocating." Emma listened as Margaret described the community's decline since the confrontation. Nearly a third of the families had left, either following Emma's example or simply seeking less restrictive congregations. Those who remained lived under increasingly authoritarian rules, with Pastor David seeming to blame every problem on Emma's corrupting influence. "I want to leave," Margaret admitted, "but I'm 46 years old with 3 children and no job skills. I've never lived outside the community. I don't even know how to start." Emma smiled, remembering her own terror at the prospect of change. "I was 67 with no computer skills when I started. Age isn't the limitation. Fear is." Over the following weeks, Emma quietly helped Margaret plan her transition. Using connections built through her platform, Emma arranged job interviews for Margaret at nonprofits focused on helping people leave restrictive religious situations. The work would be meaningful and would value Margaret's experience rather than seeing her background as a limitation. The reunion with Timothy happened naturally when he arrived to help Margaret move to her new apartment in Las Vegas. For the first time in decades, Emma's children were in the same room by choice rather than obligation. Watching Timothy teach Margaret how to use smartphone apps while they debated the best neighborhoods for her son's schooling, Emma felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with social media metrics or speaking fees. Sarah came home for Thanksgiving, her freshman confidence mixed with the earnestness Emma remembered from her own youth. Over dinner in Emma's new house, a modest place in a Las Vegas suburb that felt palatial compared to her old cabin, Sarah shared stories about her journalism classes and her plans to write about religious freedom for her senior capstone project. "I want to interview you," Sarah told Emma as they cleaned dishes together. "Not as my grandmother, but as a subject. I want to understand how you found the courage to change everything so late in life." Emma laughed, still adjusting to being seen as an interview-worthy subject by her own granddaughter. "What makes you think it was courage? Maybe it was just stubbornness." "Same thing sometimes," Sarah replied wisely. The holidays brought unexpected joy. Bobby's grandchildren from Phoenix joined them, finally able to meet the grandfather they'd only known through supervised video calls. Margaret's sons adapted to their new freedoms with the resilience of youth, though 8-year-old Daniel still asked when they could visit the desert community where he'd been born. "Maybe someday," Emma told him, though privately she wondered if Faith's Haven would survive another year. The reports from Ruth Hayes, who'd remained in the community despite supporting Emma, suggested that Pastor David's increasingly desperate leadership was driving away even loyal families. On New Year's Eve, Emma published a video that had been months in the making. Titled The Real Cost of Authenticity, it addressed directly the losses that had accompanied her transformation. She spoke honestly about the relationships that hadn't survived, the family members who still refused contact, the community traditions she missed despite everything. "Freedom isn't free," Emma said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence she'd developed over 18 months of speaking her truth. "Authenticity costs something. The question isn't whether you'll lose anything. You will. The question is whether what you gain is worth what you have to give up." The video became her most shared content ever, resonating with people facing their own difficult choices about whether to prioritize peace or truth, comfort or growth. As Emma prepared for bed that night in her Las Vegas home, surrounded by family photos that now included chosen family alongside blood relatives, she reflected on the year's changes. Tomorrow, she would begin planning the second annual conference, continue building the scholarship program, and work on the memoir that publishers were eagerly awaiting. But tonight, she was simply a woman who'd learned that it was never too late to become who she was meant to be, and who'd discovered that the most important legacy she could leave was showing others that transformation was possible at any age. Despite any obstacles, the cost had been real and sometimes devastating. But the life she'd built on the other side of that cost was more authentic, more joyful, and more purposeful than anything she'd ever imagined possible in her 67 years of careful compliance. Emma Mitchell had finally learned to live without permission, and in doing so, had given countless others permission to do the same. Emma Mitchell had finally learned to live without permission, and in doing so, had given countless others permission to do the same. But as she prepared for what felt like a pilgrimage back to where it all began, Emma understood that some journeys come full circle in ways that transform not just the traveler, but the very landscape they once called home. 2 years after her dramatic exit from the Faith's Haven community meeting, Emma drove the familiar desert highway toward Searchlight with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Beside her, Bobby navigated using the GPS on his smartphone, a device that would have been considered demonic contraband in their former community. In the back seat sat Sophia, her laptop open as she prepared to document what might be Emma's most significant homecoming yet. The reason for their return was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Faith's Haven was dissolving. Ruth Hayes, now 80, had called Emma the week before with news that Pastor David had suffered what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown. The community that had once boasted over 200 members now housed fewer than 40, mostly elderly holdouts who had nowhere else to go. "The families with children left first," Ruth had explained during their phone call. Then the middle-aged couples who realized they could practice their faith without living in isolation. David's response was to tighten restrictions even further, but that just drove away more people. Now he's talking about purifying the community by removing anyone who questions his authority. Emma had listened with a complex mix of emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. Her warnings about authoritarian leadership had proven prophetic. But mostly she felt sad for the man who'd once called her Aunt Emma, and for the community that had raised her, even if it had also constrained her. "There's something else," Ruth had continued. "The county is considering taking over the property for unpaid taxes. If that happens, all the historical records, the founding documents, the genealogy work you spent decades compiling, it could all be lost." That possibility had convinced Emma to make the journey home. The records represented not just her life's work, but the stories of families who'd built something meaningful before fear and control had corrupted it. As they drove into Searchlight, Emma was struck by how much the town had changed. The library where she'd first learned to use a computer now bore a small plaque. Emma Mitchell Digital Learning Center for Seniors. Janet Coleman had retired, but still volunteered, teaching computer classes to older adults from across Nevada who'd heard about the program through Emma's platform. But it was the sight of Faith's Haven itself that truly shocked Emma. The neat rows of small homes looked shabby and unkempt. Gardens that had once been carefully tended were overgrown with weeds. Solar panels were broken or missing entirely. And the community meeting hall that had once been the center of collective life stood empty, its windows boarded up. "Jesus," Bobby whispered, using the exclamation that would have earned him a rebuke in the old days. "It looks like a ghost town." Ruth Hayes met them at what had once been the community's main entrance. At 80, she moved more slowly, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her such a formidable ally during Emma's confrontation with her son. "Emma, dear," Ruth embraced her warmly. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Where is everyone?" Emma asked, looking around at the desolate landscape. "Gone," Ruth said simply. The Johnsons moved to a Methodist community in Utah. The Stevens family relocated to Las Vegas. Martha's working as a bookkeeper now, if you can believe it. Bill Crawford bought a small farm outside Reno. They're all doing well, from what I key. Here. Ruth led them through the community, pointing out empty houses and sharing updates about former residents. Many, she explained, had used Emma's videos as inspiration for their own transitions to independent living. Others had found less restrictive religious communities that allowed them to maintain their faith without sacrificing their autonomy or family relationships. "Your influence didn't destroy the community," Ruth said as they walked. "It revealed what was already broken and gave people permission to seek something healthier." They found Pastor David in the small house that had once served as the community's administrative center. At 51, he looked a decade older, his hair gone gray and his once commanding presence reduced to nervous agitation. When he saw Emma, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "You," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You did this. You destroyed everything our fathers built." Emma looked at the man who had once been like a nephew to her, seeing not the authoritarian leader who had tried to silence her, but a broken person whose entire identity had been built on controlling others. "David, I didn't destroy anything. I just refused to be destroyed by it. My father's legacy, generations of faithful living, families who trusted me to guide them." David's voice cracked. "They all chose your way over God's way." "They chose freedom over fear," Emma replied gently. "That's not the same thing as choosing my way over God's way." Sophia, who had been quietly recording the conversation, stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, would you be willing to share your perspective for the documentary we're making about religious communities in transition?" David looked at her with confusion and suspicion. "Documentary? We're not here to condemn anyone," Emma explained. "We're here to understand what happened, to preserve the history, both the good and the difficult parts, and to help communities find healthier ways forward." Over the next several hours, something unexpected happened. As Emma, Bobby, and Ruth went through the community's records, and David talked with Sophia, the pastor began to share his own story of struggling with the burden of leadership, the pressure to maintain his father's legacy, and his growing fear that he was losing control of everything that had defined his identity. "I wasn't trying to be cruel," David said at one point, his voice small and uncertain. "I thought I was protecting people. I thought the outside world would destroy their faith, their families, their children's innocence." "But fear isn't protection," Emma replied. "It's just another kind of destruction." The most significant moment came when David asked Emma to show him her videos. Sitting in the same room where he'd once planned her excommunication, he watched her tell the story of their community with nuance and compassion. She hadn't portrayed Faith's Haven as a cult or its members as victims. Instead, she'd shared the story of people trying to live according to their values while wrestling with the challenge of maintaining those values in a changing world. "You didn't lie about us," David said quietly as the video ended. "I told my truth," Emma replied, "which included the good things this place gave me, the sense of community, the emphasis on service, the deep faith that many people here lived out beautifully. but it also included the ways that fear and control damaged people I loved. As the afternoon wore on, David made a decision that surprised everyone. He asked Emma to help him document the community's real history before it was lost forever. Not the sanitized version that had been officially recorded, but the complete story that included both the inspired vision of the founders and the gradual transformation of that vision into something controlling and fearful. Maybe, David said hesitantly, there's a way to preserve what was good while acknowledging what went wrong. Maybe other communities can learn from our mistakes. Emma looked around the room that had once felt like a prison and now simply felt like a place where complicated, well-meaning people had tried their best and sometimes failed. I think that would be a worthy legacy for your father's memory. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, Emma stood outside the community meeting hall one last time. Tomorrow, she and Bobby would return to Las Vegas with carloads of historical documents that would be preserved and digitized through her foundation. David had agreed to undergo counseling and consider different approaches to religious leadership. Ruth had decided to move to Las Vegas to be closer to Emma and to help with the foundation's work. Most surprisingly, several former community members had expressed interest in creating a new kind of intentional community, one based on mutual support and shared values, but without the authoritarian structure that had ultimately destroyed Faith's haven. "Do you think people can really change?" Sophia asked as they loaded the last boxes into their cars. Emma looked back at the community that had shaped her for 67 years, then forward toward the highway that would take her home to the life she'd built through choice rather than obligation. "I think people can grow," Emma said finally. "And sometimes what looks like destruction is actually transformation. The question isn't whether change is possible, it's whether we have the courage to embrace it when it comes." As they drove away from Faith's haven for what might be the last time, Emma felt a profound sense of completion. She'd come full circle, but the circle was larger now, encompassing not just her own transformation, but the ripple effects that had touched countless other lives. The community that had tried to silence her voice had ultimately amplified it, and in doing so had perhaps found its own path toward redemption. The community that had tried to silence her voice had ultimately amplified it, and in doing so, had perhaps found its own path toward redemption. But as Emma Mitchell stood at the altar of a small Las Vegas chapel, surrounded by the most unlikely wedding party imaginable, she understood that redemption was just another word for the courage to begin again. At 69, Emma wore a simple cream-colored dress that would have been scandalous in Faith's haven, sleeveless, knee-length, and paired with jewelry she'd chosen herself. Beside her, Bobby Wilson at 74 looked distinguished in a navy suit, his eyes bright with the joy of a man who'd found love when he'd stopped looking for it. Their wedding was being live-streamed to Emma's now 8 million followers, but more importantly, it was witnessed by the family they'd created through choice and courage. Timothy walked her down the aisle, his face beaming with pride for a mother who'd taught him that it was never too late to surprise yourself. Margaret sat in the front row with her 3 sons, her own transformation evident in her confident posture and the job title on her business card: Program Director, 2nd Chapter. Foundation. Sarah, now a junior studying journalism, served as Emma's maid of honor, her college confidence tempered by the wisdom she'd inherited from watching her grandmother remake her life. But perhaps the most moving presence was Ruth Hayes, now 81, who'd become Emma's closest confidant and the Foundation's most effective board member. Ruth's decision to officiate the ceremony, she'd gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose, represented a beautiful circle of redemption. The mother of the pastor who'd tried to silence Emma now had the honor of blessing Emma's new beginning. "Dearly beloved," Ruth began, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades of living, "we gather today to witness something remarkable, the union of 2 people who've learned that love, like authenticity, has no expiration date." As Ruth spoke about the courage it takes to be vulnerable at any age, Emma's mind wandered to the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The memoir she'd published 6 months ago, Never Too Late, My Journey from Silent Elder to Digital Rebel, had spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and had been translated into 32 languages. The advance alone had funded scholarships for over 200 young people seeking education beyond their restrictive communities. The book had also led to something Emma had never expected: a movie deal. Hollywood producers wanted to tell her story, with discussions already underway about casting. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd been forbidden to watch movies was now going to be portrayed in one, but success still felt secondary to the relationships she'd rebuilt and the lives she'd touched. The second chapter foundation had grown beyond anything she'd imagined, with satellite programs in 12 countries helping people transition out of restrictive situations. The scholarship programs Sarah had inspired had evolved into a comprehensive support network that provided not just funding, but counseling, career guidance, and community for people brave enough to choose authenticity over security. Emma and Bobby, Ruth continued, do you promise to support each other's continued growth, to celebrate each other's authentic selves, and to face whatever challenges come with the wisdom you've gained through your individual journeys? We do, they said together, their voices strong and certain. Emma looked out at the small gathering and saw Helen Martinez, who'd become not just a business partner, but the sister she'd never had. Helen's transformation had been quieter than Emma's, but no less profound. She'd recently announced her engagement to a retired teacher she'd met at one of Emma's conferences, proving that late-life love could bloom in the most unexpected ways. Sofia Rodriguez sat with her new husband, their baby daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Sofia had evolved from Emma's social media manager to the foundation's executive director, bringing the organizational skills and technological expertise that had turned Emma's platform into a movement. More importantly, she'd become like a daughter to Emma, representing the bridge between generations that technology could create when used with wisdom and intention. The ceremony concluded with a reading from Robert's journal, words Emma had discovered years after his death that seemed written for this moment. I hope Emma finds the courage to be everything she's capable of being. I hope she learns that love, in all its forms, is worth the risk of being fully known. As Bobby kissed his new wife, the small chapel erupted in applause. But Emma barely heard it over the sound of her own heart, which at 69 was still capable of surprising her with its capacity for joy. The reception was held at the Emma Mitchell Digital Learning Center, the expanded version of the Searchlight Library where her journey had begun. Janet Coleman, now retired but still teaching, had helped coordinate the event. The symbolism was perfect, celebrating the future in the place where Emma had first discovered her possibilities. During the dinner, Emma stood to address the gathering, looking out at faces that represented every chapter of her journey. 3 years ago, she began, I thought my story was ending. I thought the most important chapters of my life were behind me, that my role was to fade gracefully into the background while younger people took center stage. She paused, looking at Bobby, whose love had shown her that partnership could enhance rather than diminish individual growth. What I learned is that our stories don't end until we stop writing them. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. That authenticity isn't a destination you reach, but a practice you commit to, day after day, choice after choice. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. I also learned that individual transformation is powerful, but community transformation is revolutionary. Every person who's found the courage to leave a restrictive situation, every family that's chosen love over control, every young person who's pursued education despite opposition, you've all proved that change is possible at any age, in any circumstance. As the evening wound down, Emma found herself in conversation with David Hayes, who'd driven up from Searchlight for the ceremony. His presence had surprised everyone, but Emma had insisted he be welcomed. The past year of therapy and soul-searching had softened his edges, and he'd begun working with a progressive religious organization that helped fundamentalist communities transition to healthier models of faith. "Emma," David said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Not just for trying to silence you, but for the years of making you feel small. My father would be ashamed of what I let fear do to his community." Emma studied the man who'd once seemed so powerful and threatening. "David, your father would be proud of the courage you're showing now. It takes strength to admit mistakes and choose growth over pride." They talked for a few more minutes about his work with struggling religious communities, about the new model of faith-based living he was helping develop, one that honored tradition while embracing autonomy. It wasn't the faith's haven that had shaped Emma's youth, but it wasn't the authoritarian community it had become either. It was something new, something born from the lessons of failure and the possibility of redemption. As the last guests departed, Emma stood with Bobby outside the learning center, looking up at the Nevada sky that had always made her feel both small and infinite. Tomorrow would bring new adventures. They were planning a honeymoon trip to Ireland, where Emma would research the genealogy that had started her entire journey. Next month, she'd speak at a conference in Tokyo about aging with authenticity. The memoir's success had led to a second book contract, this one about building community in the digital age. But tonight, she was simply a woman who'd learned that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. A woman who'd discovered that the most radical act might be refusing to make yourself smaller to fit others' expectations. A woman who'd proved that influence isn't about having power over others, but about giving others permission to discover their own power. At 69, Emma Mitchell had become exactly who she was meant to be, not despite her age, but because of it. Not in spite of her past, but through the wisdom it had given her. Not by rejecting everything she'd been taught, but by choosing what to keep and what to release. As she and Bobby walked hand in hand toward their new life together, Emma felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a story well told, not because it had a perfect ending, but because it was authentically hers. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of tomorrow. And Emma Mitchell, digital rebel and grandmother of authenticity, was finally completely home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.